Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 5th of March of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And currently we're entering probably the most important and the most decisive part of the special military operation, because sooner or later the negotiation process will begin, and sooner or later both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, will be forced to stay and to stand on their lines without any movements. So that is why it is important during the next 2, 3, 4 weeks or 2 months to improve our own positions as much as possible. The Ukrainians need to improve their positions and the Russians as well. I'm not saying that when the negotiation process starts, it's going to be like the end of the special military operation. Most likely several times this negotiation process will be broken, both by the Russians, either by the Russians or the Ukrainians. But anyway, during every single negotiation period of time, there are going to be possibilities for both Russians and Ukrainians to improve their positions before another wave of offensive operation or another wave of attack. So that's why now it is very important to have everything. Everything is basically important right now. Every single bullet, every single missile, every single aircraft, every single military supply, every single partner, every single ally, everything is important right now. And exactly right now the United States of America decided to cut Ukraine from the military support. The United States of America, the most important, decided to cut off intelligence sharing with Kiev. That was stated by the Financial Times, and that was confirmed by several officials of the United States of America. The United States has cut off intelligence sharing with Kiev in a move that could seriously hamper the Ukrainian military's ability to target Russian forces, according to officials familiar with the matter. The move follows the decision on Monday by Trump administration to suspend military aid deliveries to Ukraine, and comes after a dramatic breakdown in relations between the United States President and Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky. U.S. intelligence cooperation has been essential for Ukraine's ability to identify and strike Russian military targets. And the most important is not even to strike Russian targets. The most important is that US intelligence provided the Ukrainians the most important information, and we are talking about the concentration of forces. Now the Russians, for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, has the possibilities to concentrate forces, to concentrate attack fist anywhere along the line of combat contact, and the Ukrainians will not even know about this. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. During the previous 24 hours we got significant number of updates, and first let's talk about the Zaporizhzhia direction. During the previous 24 hours the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions along the entire Zaporizhzhia front line. A lot of FABs, a lot of temporary deployment points were destroyed. Of course the Ukrainians are in panic because they don't know for sure whether this direction is going to be, let's say, a primary direction for the Russian major offensive operation, because basically they don't know and they can't see whether the Russians are trying to concentrate additional attack fist in this area or not. They don't have access to the intelligence information, but the Russians are doing everything right now to force the Ukrainians to think that this offensive, this direction is going to be a major. Furthermore, I'll remind you that Putin reported and said in the past that Zaporizhzhia should become a part of Russia, and Ukrainians should abandon their territories in this area if they want to settle a conflict with the Russians. Furthermore, when talking about the soldiers on the ground, during the previous 24 hours we have had several reports that the Russians managed to improve their positions in the direction of the settlements by the name of Mali Sherbaki and Sherbaki. So I'll repeat once again, the Russians are doing everything they can with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to think that this direction is going to be a primary direction for the Russians during the next several weeks or months before the beginning of the negotiation process. At the same time, the Russians are trying to force the Ukrainians to think that probably another possible direction of Russian offensive operation might be the area in the vicinity of Velika Novosilka. Today, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Privolna. This territory was colored in Russian favor yesterday or the day before yesterday based on the reports and geolocations that came from this area on the 3rd of March, but most likely just by the beginning of the 5th of March, the Russians managed to secure this territory completely. So once again, the Russians have a very good dynamic in this area, and the Ukrainians may think that the Russians may continue offensive operation in this area with the purpose to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to answer the operational space and to answer the space that has no defense lines from the Ukrainian side. As for the Bogoslavka direction, Bogatyr direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got several videos and several geolocations of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the temporary deployment points of the armed force of Ukraine, but without any changes on the ground. Obviously, this is a very big puzzle, very interesting question, why the Russians decided not to finish the battle for these settlements, why the Russians decided to take a pause. Very interesting details are coming from the north in Andreevka direction. Today, several pro-Russian resources have adjusted maps to the north of the settlement of Andreevka, which means that most likely these fields and this pocket between the settlements of Andreevka and the settlement of Yaseneva is something like the next target. The Russians most likely will try to cut this territory, to cut this area, and to take everything to the east of this red line under complete control. Obviously, the Russians need to maintain the lines to shorten the line of combat contact, and then they will be able to release additional forces that could be used in further offensive operations towards the border with the Dnipro region. Now we are coming to the Pokrovsk direction. When talking about this territory, we see that the Russians still suffer problems in this area. First, let's discuss the situation in the southwestern flank. Let's talk about the settlement of Uspienovka. This morning, the pro-Ukrainian sources published, more precisely maybe even yesterday in the evening, anyway, several hours ago, maybe up to more than 10 hours ago, the Ukrainian sources published additional changes on their map, and according to those changes, the Ukrainians, as a result of counter-offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Uspienovka. And this morning, without geolocations, we have adjusted the map in the eastern part of Uspienovka in Ukrainian favor, more precisely in the favor of contested area. But later, another pro-Ukrainian source published another video where we can see how the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian units in the almost central part of the settlement of Uspienovka. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map back again, so most likely there are very heavy clashes in this part of the village, but the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack, and we will discuss in a minute the main purposes and the main tasks of the Ukrainians. And we believe that Ukrainians will increase their pressure in this area, and almost since the beginning of when this pocket has been established, we were talking and we are saying and we are telling you that most likely the Ukrainians will be able to cut this pocket and to force the Russians to fall back. Now let's discuss the situation in the southeastern part of the same pocket. Let's talk about the settlement of Shevchenko. I'll remind you that since the beginning of this year, the Ukrainians carried out several counter-offensive operations in this area. The Ukrainians mainly were counter-attacking the Russian position in the vicinity of Kotlina and in the village itself, and several pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the units of the 25th Air Mobile Brigade, as a result of counter-offensive operations, managed to restore control over this settlement. The Russians reported that the settlement remains under complete Russian control, and the latest geolocations show us that this village half under Russian control and half of the village is in a contested area, but we are not 100% sure that the situation on the ground is exactly as we just described. Also, since the beginning of this year, the Ukrainians carried out several successful counterattacks in the area of Pishane, and there was a moment when the Ukrainians were controlling up to 50% of the settlement, but later the Russians counterattacked in this area and so forced the Ukrainians to fall back. The latest geolocations show us that the Russians control probably 90% of the settlement. And starting on the 4th and on the 5th of March, the Ukrainians launched another wave of offensive offensive operation. This time the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russian units in the area of the settlement by the name of Shevchenka. And today the Russian sources published the video how they were repelling another Ukrainian counteroffensive operation. The Ukrainians in this attack were using up to 4 armored fighting infantry vehicles. The Ukrainians were using several personnel carriers, probably with a significant number of stormtroopers. The Russians tried to stop the Ukrainians with FPV drones, but several vehicles of the armored forces of Ukraine managed to reach the settlement of Shevchenka. Infantry landed in this area, and the Ukrainians managed to establish control over the southeastern part of the settlement. Based on this video that was published by the Russian side, we have adjusted the map and we have colored the road and the southeastern part of the settlement of Shevchenka in Ukrainian favor. This is very important offensive operation because from these positions the Ukrainians have complete control over the main supply line that goes in the direction of Shevchenka. So from these positions, if the Russians decide to bring forces to this area using, let's say, railways or using this road, these vehicles from the armed force of Russian Federation would be caught under Ukrainian control and would be destroyed as a result of, let's say, anti-tank missile fire or artillery strikes. So basically this road was established, the Ukrainians cut this road with FPV drone strikes and artillery control. So this is the reason why the Ukrainians are trying now to counterattack in the area of Uspienovka, because the Russians still have possibilities to support their forces in the area of Shevchenka through the settlements of Toretsk and Novopustinka. So the Russians still can use the road T-0515 and then to turn in the eastern direction, and using the same road the Russians can support their forces in the area of Shevchenka. So that's why Ukrainians try to counterattack from the settlement of Novoalexandriivka and Uspienovka with the purpose to restore control over Novovasilievka, and from these positions to establish complete fire control over this territory, which will allow the Ukrainians to cut the Russians in the area of Vovkovo, Salone, Udashne and Kotlina from supply and support, and basically with these counterattacks to cut the salient completely. So once again, we believe that right before the beginning of the negotiation process, the Ukrainians will do all they can with the purpose to cut the salient and to restore control over all these settlements. Why is this? Because the Ukrainians are going to sign an agreement with the United States of America about the rare metals, and according to information we have, one of the best probably rare metals, rare minerals are located in this area. There are several mines. This is the first mine in the area of Shevchenka. This is the second mine in the vicinity of Udachne, and the minerals from this mine, basically the coal from these mines, the Ukrainians are using in their steel, in their economy, in their steel metallurgy, and this brings a lot of money to Ukrainian budget. So that's why they will try to restore this control over this territory if the negotiation process is inevitable. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the city of Toretsk, because we continue receiving interesting updates and the things are developing the way that most likely the Ukrainians are trying to do everything they can with the purpose to force the Russians to fall back from the settlement of Toretsk, and the Ukrainians, as we can see, are trying to restore control also over strategical points, over mines, over different places where the Ukrainians can extract rare metals and then to sell them to the United States of America. During the previous 24 hours, the Russian sources published another video how the Ukrainians were counterattacking. And when talking about this video, as a result of this counterattack that the Russians shown us, the Ukrainians managed to answer the southwestern part of the Zabalka micro district, which is the southern part of the city of Toretsk. Of course, the Russians were trying to repel Ukraine counteroffensive operation. The Russians were using artillery, FPV drones, but several infantry fighting vehicles of the armored forces of Ukraine managed to enter the southern part of the Zabalka district and to land infantry. Basically, the let's say the edge position that was discovered during that video took place exactly in this place. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. So I'll remind you that during the previous several days, the Ukrainians first carried out several counterattacks in the most northern part of the city of Toretsk, and they managed to take under control several positions in this area, at least according to different mappers. Furthermore, we got a lot of geolocations that confirm Ukrainian control over most the central part of the city in the area of the stadium and the citadel. Several buildings were also captured by the Ukrainians. And now we see that the Ukrainians carry out several more counterattacks, and now the Ukrainians are aiming the Zabalka micro district, and we see that Ukrainians managed to restore control over some positions. We believe that Ukrainians will increase the pressure because they need to show that they are still able to counterattack, that they still have power and forces to give the Russians a battle, and maybe the Ukrainians will try to restore control over this city as well. And if the Ukrainians are able to do this, obviously this is going to be very significant damage to the Russian reputation. And now we understand how important for Ukrainians right now to have intelligence and reconnaissance operation, how important for the Ukrainians to have access to the HIMARS missile systems and to the Patriot air defense systems and air defense missiles. And now we see that Ukrainians were cut completely from all these things, and most likely all these attacks, all this attempt from the Ukrainian side will not give any results, because the Russians from their side can save their control over let's say space, over line of combat contact, and in comparison with the Ukrainians, the Russians know exactly where the Ukrainians are trying to concentrate forces and are trying to counterattack. So we believe that maybe the Ukrainians planned all these counteroffensive operations, but when they were planning all these attacks, most likely they didn't know and they didn't believe that the United States of America will cut them from intelligence information. But when this happened, the Ukrainians decided not to change their plans, but to continue offensive operation with the purpose probably, or with hope that maybe the intelligence information they got, the last one, will be enough for them to carry out these counterattacks. But obviously maybe this will be enough for now, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but in a month obviously the Ukrainians would suffer problems, first problems at least with intelligence information. According to information we have, the Russians continue improving their positions in the central part of the city of Chasiv Yar, as for now without any changes on the ground. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the southern Kupiansk direction. Today, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. According to geolocations and videos that were published by the Ukrainian side, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation in this area, managed to take under control very powerful and dense network of the fortifications. We're talking about this area. At least 4 strongholds were captured by the Russians, and when talking about different mappers, different sources, I'm talking about maps where you can find strongholds of the armed force of Ukraine or the Russian Federation, you will see that Ukrainians have no defenses, have no lines between this territory and the city of Liman. So just several strongholds that were built even maybe by the Russians during the 2022 in the vicinity of the city of Liman, and that's it. So I'm just trying to tell you that the Russians managed to take the first and the last line of defense in front of the city of Liman, and everything inside of this field is almost empty, and the Russians most likely will suffer no barriers and no problems to move through this area with the purpose to begin the third and probably the final battle for the city of Liman. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the northern Kupiansk direction. According to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainians, as a result of counter-offensive operation, managed to restore control over the forest to the north of the city of the village of Zaporizhzhia. We can't say anything about this because first the Ukrainians shown us this territory under complete Russian control without any geolocations and proofs. Now they restore control. Maybe this is the kind of victory that was achieved just on the papers without any, let's say, real clashes on the ground. So based on this report, we basically restored everything as it used to be before the first pro-Ukrainian sources published information about this area. But even though, despite all these things, indeed, the Ukrainians during the previous several days, according to different mappers, counterattacked the Russians between Sinkovka, Liman, Pershi and the river of Oskol, and maybe by this attack the Ukrainians forced the Russians, let's say, to fall back and to regroup. That allowed the Ukrainians to successfully counterattack in the area of Zapadne. As for now, maybe this is exactly the situation that happened there. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly in the Sudra direction. According to information we have, currently the Russians control up to 60% of the settlement of Zhuravka, and the Russians continue advancing further in the southern direction. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the settlement of Basovka. This is the next settlement to the village of Novinka, which was also captured by the Russians according to different sources several days ago. So we see that the Russians are not going to stop. They are going to continue their offensive operation, and it is so important for the Ukrainians to have access to the intelligence information of the United States of America, but the Ukrainians have nothing, which will obviously have unpredictable consequences for Ukrainians and for their lines as well. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to take under control the pocket between the village of Lebedevka and Nikoisky. This territory was under complete Ukrainian control, but now we see that the situation is completely different. The Russians captured this territory. They captured, and the most important, the Russians crossed the river of Malaya Loknya, and now they can attack further in the western, in the eastern, the southeastern direction, and maybe the Ukrainian Russians will try to attack Kazachia Loknya from many directions. That can lead to complete collapse of the Sudzha pocket to the north of the railways. Now let's move further and let's discuss several important updates from Kiev. The United States of America are playing with Zelensky, with the Ukrainians, and Zelensky nervous. Rolling Starlink outages have begun in Ukraine. So not just Ukraine was cut from intelligence information, the United States of America are trying to show Zelensky that if he continues the same way, if he continues his position to continue the special military operation in the war with Russia, Ukraine military personnel most likely would be cut completely from Starlink, and this will lead to more unpredictable consequences than if just to cut Ukraine from intelligence information. Once again, we are entering the most important period of the special military operation, where the Ukrainians made their first step. Now the Ukrainians are moving. Now the Ukrainians are trying to control initiative, at least in the Pokrovsk and in the Toretsk directions. But if the Russians are able to break this initiative and to return initiative back in their hands, most likely the Russians can also open another front line somewhere, some front line that has become completely invisible to Ukrainians due to complete absence of any intelligence information regarding the situation on the territory of the Russian Federation. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.